Okay, right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to look at a few different ideas this evening. We're going to start with a kliyokar, which answers a question that I was asked. Someone asked me recently, and I can't remember who it was. So forgive me. Apologies if you're on the Zoom or in person and I've forgotten who asked the question. But the basic question is in the order and why primacy is given. Well, primacy is given to kahos in the sense that the kahos are the ones beginning of the parsha, end of last week's parsha. Kahos are the ones who carry the oren itself. Okay, and then Gershon is given the next one down in terms of what they are instructed to carry: the curtains of the Mishkan, etc., and the oil moed and the parochas, things like that. And then Merari afterwards. Now the problem, of course, is that Gershon is the oldest. Is the oldest, right? Is the oldest. Now the Medrash. So why is it the Gershon is why is it the Gershon number one doesn't carry the most important stuff? Gershon is the Bechor. He should carry the Aron and everything else. That's number one. And number two, why is it that the order is reversed? You have Kahos first, and then Gershon, and then Merari, where it should be Gershon, Kahos, Merari, right? That's the question. Okay. And in a way, I think the question is emphasized by the way the parshas are split up. Because it's an unusual split, it's like a continuum. You would think the three would be together. Instead we've got Kahos at the end of Bamidbar, and then we've got Gershon and Merari at the beginning of Nossos. It seems disjointed in that way. So that, in other words, the division of the parshas itself almost prompts the question. It emphasizes the fact that that there's something to be learned here. The beginning of the parsha is Nosoi es Rosh B'nei Gershon Gamheim, as if to say, don't forget about Gershon. Okay, Kahos, yes, we've elevated them, but you should also elevate the B'nai Gershon. That becomes the beginning of the parsha. We need to elevate them as well. Don't forget about them. So the kliyokar says that he asked the question. It said it should have said Gershon first. The first kliyokar on the parsha. Should have first listed B'nai Gershon and the Bechor. He says there's a Medrash Rabbah that says, you know why we don't do so? Because the Aron was given to Kahos, therefore, right? The simple answer is that it counts Kahos first because the covered of the Aron. Since the Kahos had to carry the Aron, so obviously they're listed first because that's more important, that's more significant. They have that primacy as a result of that duty. But if so, he says, he go for kasha. That itself is a problem. Why was the burden of the Aron not given to the firstborn? Right? The Torah talks about the concept of a firstborn, the primacy. So in other words, you want to answer and you want to say Kahos is listed first because they carry the Aron, but that's the problem. Why doesn't Gershon carry the Aron? Says the kliyokar as follows. He says, it seems to me that the explanation is as follows. Hashem wanted to show that the Chachomim really inherit the true honor. So to teach the lesson to the people, to honor those who learn the Torah. Is teaching a fundamental and overarching lesson that we need to always try and elevate those who, in all matters of holiness, those who are able to elevate themselves in terms of learning Torah, those who are able to attain that level should always be elevated. Just as Kahos is put first, because the word of Hashem is with him. In other words, Kahos, the family of Kahos, is where Moshe and Aaron come from. So the word of Hashem emanates from the family of Kahos. So because of that, the Torah also gives Kahos the primacy in terms of what they carry, the most important parts of the Mishkan. And that message can only be delivered in this way. This idea of giving that primacy in all areas. Had he given the Aron to Gershon, the firstborn, or Yisrael would have said, you know why I counted him first? Because he's the firstborn. I wouldn't depend the importance on the carrying of the Aron. Al Kain, Mosa ha'Aron el Kahos. it hands the Aron to Kahos, and it counts him first. And everyone will know to give honor to the Torah and to those who learn it. The truth is you could, it's interesting, the Kliyach is a little bit cryptic here. He just says, because of the burden of the word of Hashem, that's with Kahos. Now, at first I thought that means because of, as I said before, because of Moshe and Aaron. It could be that he's not even focusing on that at all. He's simply saying the Torah deliberately gave the carrying of the Aron to someone who wasn't the firstborn, to emphasize that it was solely because of the fact that they were carrying the Aron that they were honored. So in other words, teaching us that bearing the Aron, bearing the Torah, is a reason to honor people, not because they happen to be the firstborn, right? Had it been that Gershon carried the Aron and they were the firstborn, you wouldn't have learned that, because you would have said, you know why we're honoring them? It's the firstborn. Yeah, honor the firstborn. But because it was someone who wasn't the firstborn who's carrying the Aron, therefore we learn how much we have to honor those who carry, those who lift the Torah, so to speak, those who carry the Aron. That's the idea that he's, I think, trying to express. Yeah.
One of Merari, or
so no, Merari seems to almost be put it third from either perspective. In other words, the logical place to go. I did see this somewhere as well. I think the logical place to go is next to Kahos, because if you're saying you want to teach this message, therefore you, so to speak, demote Gershon, because otherwise you wouldn't. The only way to deliver the message is by giving Kahos the primacy. So therefore, the next logical place to go is to the next one, which is Kahos itself. According to what the Kliyakar is explaining, it fits beautifully with a lesson which the Torah teaches us across the whole Torah, really. This is a fundamental point. It's emphasized again and again. If you look across from the very beginning of Bereshis, you will notice that the primacy and the inheritance, normally, the ones who actually become the prime, if you like, transmitters of the Masorah are not the Bechorim, right? Yeah, that's very often the case, right? Yitzchak, Yaakov, they're all not Bechorim, right? For that reason, right? Because they are all, Moshe Rabbeinu was also the youngest son. So this is a continuum thing. David HaMelech, it's all the way through tonight. The whole idea, the whole thing with it, right? Because the message, which is reinforced again and again, which according to the Kliyakar is beautifully emphasized here as well, is that being born first, right, does not give you a right to control others simply because of that status. What gives a person status in the Torah's world perspective, right, is only what you have earned, right? And that's of course something which Soloveitchik says. I mentioned this in the past at the end of Parshas Nasso. He discusses the fact that we also have the concept of a Bechar, but there's a difference, because with us, Bechar is responsibility. That's why Yosef doesn't want it, right? What does it mean to Bechar? He says, well, you got to do all sorts of things, responsibilities, etc., etc. Don't want it, right? That's what it is. It's not about rights. It's about responsibility. That's what Bechar carries with it. Yeah. So this is again according to the Kliyakar. This is emphasized here as well. And he carries on and says that the Medrash, it relies and attaches this to the posuk of Yekorehi Mipninim, the idea that the Torah is more precious than pearls. And he says that the idea the Medrash is trying to express is that the Keser Torah Hefkel Hakol, that everyone can access the crown of Torah, and therefore that is why the Aron, this is the same idea, wasn't given specifically to the Bechar, so that the Bechar wouldn't say, hey, obviously, I have the crown of Torah, I'm the firstborn, right? Forget about everyone else. Everyone is equal. That's the idea, okay? The idea that everyone can access it, and that is presented by the Torah, that is explained by the Torah so beautifully by the fact that the Bechar, the firstborn, is deliberately not put first, not given the primacy in terms of carrying the Aron. Afterwards, the Kliyakar does bring on the last line. He says you can say the reason is because Kahos, Moshe and Aaron came from Kahos. That's why they give him primacy. But he spends much more time on this idea of that it's deliberate that Kahos is given the primacy because he's not the Bechar, right? Which is a very powerful message. Always the message is, when it comes to Torah, A person should never ever say, you're learning Torah, if you're born into it, or if you're in a privileged position, therefore you can access it, therefore you can become a Talmid Chacham. Menachasi b'kerem zovis, as Gemara says. Torah is there in the corner. It's accessible for everyone. It all depends on one's own efforts. The Chizkuni says here on the words gam heim that we should not hold back, right, from counting after them the Bnei Gershon, which really comes back to your point. The idea that Gershon, again, it's all about balance. The flip side of this is that Bnei Gershon feel like, well, okay, right, fine, but we're demoted just for this message, and therefore the parsha begins. Maybe that's also why it's split this way. Nosa es rosh b'nei Gershon gam heim. Just because they're the firstborn doesn't mean they can't make it too, right? So there's all the balance. There's the balance here. There's a very very beautiful Chofetz Chaim on the Torah, which comes out of a sort of moves on from a Rashi, Perek Hey Pasuk Yud, just moving forward in the parsha a bit. The parsha describes the matnas kahuna, the gifts that need to be given. The whole shumala kochi, whole kochi b'nei Yisrael shkivul hakohen lo yihya belongs to the kohen, and then the Torah says v'ish es kadoshov lo yihiyu, which literally means a person's, the holy things a person has, they shall be to him. Ish asher yitain la kohen lo yihya, the one who gives to the kohen shall be his. This is a very cryptic pasuk, and Rashi tries to explain it and says there are many midrashim about this pasuk. First, Rashi says because it says the gifts of the kohen and the levia. You might think they can take them by force. The simple pshat is that we have a right, the Yisraelim have a right to choose who they give them to, which is called Tovas Hano. I've got the ability. I have to give them, but I can choose which kind to give them to. Ish es kadoshov lo yiyu. The holy things I have, I can choose who to give them to. And then he says, there are many midrashim, and the Medrash Haggadah is, the ish es kadoshov lo yiyu, a person's holy things shall be his. If you hold back the ma'aser, the gifts, the kohen and the lumi, don't give them. Lo you are ma'aser. His field won't produce. To him will be the ma'aser. In other words, he will have faced that tragic consequence of only producing a tenth because he's held it back for himself. So it's kind of a midah keneged midah. And on the flip side is, a person who gives the matanos uriyos lo, who gives the right gifts to the kohen, lo yihya, momon harbe, Rashi says, he will have lots of possessions. Says the Chofetz Chaim like this. He says, kol ish v'ish mipu'ulosav sha'osim omo lo yisub amolo, that ultimately, he says, the message of this pasuk is that whatever we do in this world, from the ordinary mundane activities that we involve ourselves in, we don't, if you like, take them with us. They won't stand with us. Rak in Yoni Kedusha, only matters of holiness, Shekiyim Begufo B'oda B'chayav, the things that we do that have a Kedusha element, Torah, mitzvahs, whilst we're in this world, they will always remain strong with him, unlike everything else, which appear to be close at times, but in reality are distant. And he says, he brings a medrash. The medrash says a moshel, and says that the moshel is to a person who has three friends. One of them he's very, very close to. The second one he's a little bit close to. And the third friend, he didn't really think was very significant at all. And he says the story in the medrash relates is like this, that a king once sent to call this person, and they hurry him to bring him to the king, and the mason is terrified. Maybe they're going to tell, someone's told something bad about me to the king, what am I going to do? So he went to his first very, very close friend, the person he'd always relied on, always depended on. And he says, I'm going to go to him and I'm going to ask him, maybe he'll accompany me to the king. So he went to ask this very, very close friend. They didn't want to go with him. And he left him. There's nothing he can do. He's very upset, very sad. This man's not going to help him. So he decides to go to the second friend and ask maybe the second friend, the one I'm not so close to, but I'm still pretty close to. Maybe he'll accompany me to the king to help me. Same thing. He doesn't want to come with him to the king. So he finally goes to the third friend, the one who he considered to be pretty insignificant. Yeah, they were a bit of an acquaintance, wasn't such a good friend, didn't really think very much of him. And he asked, will you accompany me to the king? And after he tells him everything that's happened with his previous two friends. And the guy says to him, the third person says, don't worry, I will accompany you to the king. I will speak to the king on your behalf. Nothing bad will happen to you. And that's what he did. And he saves him from the negative things that were going to happen to him from the king. Says the Chofetz Chaim, he says that the three friends represent the three different things that we have the potential to rely on in life. He says the first thing we have to rely on, the one we feel closest to of all, is our finances, our financial possessions, the monetary things that we have, money that we have. The person is very, very close to them. But sadly, when a person passes on, it doesn't take anything with him. So that friend who he was so reliant on suddenly is not there for him. Time he's called for the king, the friend's not there. The second very close friend, he says, is all those the close relatives, close family members. They accompany the person, and they accompany the person, but they as well. They accompany him only up to the kever. They can't accompany him any further, says the Chofetz Chaim. The third friend, however important they are, but they can't take them with him. The third friend, the one that is able to actually be there with him when it really counts, ultimately, is tshuva and ma'asim tovim. The good deeds, the tshuva, and the things that people do that actually accompany us. As it says, he brings the posuk, your righteousness will go before you. That's how it is. He says the king, of course, is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what Hashem is interested in. He says the greatest friends, the way to read this posuk is, Ish es Kadoshov lo yihiyu. The great friends, the Kadoshov, the holy things that we have in life, lo yihiyu, they will be for us. Ish es Kadoshov, every person, Kadoshov lo yihiyu, the holy things, they will remain for him, they will last for him, they will always be with him, they will be his friends, they will be the things that will always be there in good stead for a person. And the posuk ends off and says, Isha she'itein lakoyin lo yihiyah. Only the chesed that we do, asher yitzein lakoyin, right? The chesed that we do, lo yihiyah, that stays with us. That's what Chofetz Chaim understands this process. So there is there's the Ramban. It's quite a difficult Ramban. I think for that reason, though, maybe it's worth seeing it because it's perhaps something that isn't perhaps learned that much. The Ramban gives us an understanding at some level, at least, into Parshas Sota. The Rambam says on Perek Hey Posuk Chof, Chof and Chof Aleph. He says the second paragraph in the Ramban it's Ramban. It's Psukim Chof to Chof Aleph, Perek Hey Chof to Chof Aleph. The Ramban points out the fact that the Parsha of the Sota is completely unique. There is nothing else like it in the Torah. It is what you call trial by ordeal. And it's the only example of it in the Torah, right? The idea that it's basically, the mitzvah is reliant on a nes. It is one of the mitzvahs of the Torah, Parshas Sota, but it can only be fulfilled through this incredible miracle. That so bitna, if she's guilty, this happens, whatever, There says the Ramban, second paragraph, there is nothing in all the laws of the Torah, the only thing is this inyan, Shupela v'nes kavua. It's a wonder, and it was a fixed miracle. Sheyasa b'Yisrael b'yosem rubam osem etzon shemokum. So you need to understand that the whole parsha only applied when the majority of Klal Yisrael were living according to the Torah, fulfilling the will of Hashem. What is the essence of Parshas Sota? To teach how critically important it is to ensure the purity of Klal Yisrael, to ensure there's no possibility of bringing mamzerus chas v'shalom into Klal Yisrael. The idea of the horrific tragedy which accompanies mamzerus, of course, the case of the Sota being one. That's why it applies in the context of a woman, because this is a married woman and she goes with someone else. That is the classic case of leading to chas v'shalom to cases of mamzerus, and the immense tragedy that brings with it. And therefore, he says, the whole thing stopped once, unfortunately, things became spoiled. People were doing Averis. The Gemara says in Sota, when the adultery was increased, Posku Mei Sota, it stopped working. He brings a posuk in Hosea that supports this as well. And he says that this nace was done lichvoidom v'liyosam am kodesh. It was done to honor them, for us to be considered to be Kedusha, holy people. It got to a stage when they didn't understand the fact that it was good. They didn't desire it, didn't want it.
They didn't understand the concept at all. And he says that pasuk in Hosea, which describes this, finishes off with the words "Va'am lo yovin yilo beit," which he explains to mean that a people that does not understand will be captured by its foolishness. That's effectively yilochet b'sichlusa, will be caught by its foolishness. And what I think, when he goes on to bring the Gemara in Sota, which says only when the man as well is menukah me'oven, is claimed from sin, will the water be bodek his wife, if not, not. And he says some say that if the husband ever had any illicit relationship, doesn't work as well. Even if it's some say, and from the halach he says it comes out, if he didn't rebuke his children either in this area, also wouldn't work. For Haklal, he finishes off with the words "Shuneis v'kavod liYisrael." The Ramban, in a way, turns almost like the parsha on its head, right? This is a parsha; it's a difficult parsha to understand. You know, the punishment that can occur, etc., etc. But when you look at it like this, the Ramban is saying you have to understand this was totally miraculous, and when it applied, it was because it was understood that way, right? And people were at the level to understand that as a tremendous kavod, an amazing thing. Hashem says, the Kedusha of Klal Yisrael is so important to me that I will, kaviyachol, so to speak, put myself out on a limb and perform a miracle to ensure that Kedusha remains complete. It's a kavod then. The whole parsha becomes an honor. But of course, only when it's understood that way. As soon as people didn't understand that, as soon as people went off, sadly, in different directions and didn't appreciate that, then the parsha couldn't apply anymore because they weren't worthy of that honor, of that miracle. I think it's an important perspective on the parsha. It doesn't, I think it's something which needs to be studied properly and carefully and understood. And it's about the aspirations of holiness and about what Kedusha means and the importance it has to Klal Yisrael, particularly in this area. Briefly, let me share with you just in the few minutes we have left. There is another kliyok which I don't have time to go through inside, which I wanted to go through, but it's on the nozer. The kliyok picks up on there are three approaches to the word yafli. Perek Vov Posuk Base. Isha Yishak Yafli Lindor Neder Nozer Lahazel Hashem. Now that word yafli is a difficult word to understand, right? It's yafrish. It means we translate. Rashi says to explain, clarity. Gemara, if you learn Maseches Nozer, the Gemara in Nozer, which is notoriously difficult in many ways to understand. Those who might vaguely recall some of it, but basically the word yafli, the Gemara goes to great lengths trying to say what that means. It means something. It seems to mean, going to the way the Gemara explains it, it's a form of clarity, to be explicit, to be clear. You're making a vow of being a Nozer, right? The Kliyaka brings. I'll just sort of summarize outside for you what he says. He brings three different approaches and ways of understanding that word yafli. The first one is that it means to distinguish. The idea being that it's an idea of really to distinguish in the sense of havdalah, right? What does wine do? Wine confuses, yeah, because that's what wine does to your head. So wine makes it difficult to make a distinction between things in life because it confuses you, it mixes your head up, right? So the yafli, Linda, the vow of Nazir, is to understand the importance of making havdalah, being mavdil, being kodesh l'chol. To understand, I want to make a clear distinction between what is kodesh and what is chol, and therefore that person takes a vow to be a Nazir so that they have that clarity in life of distinguishing between kodesh and chol. That's one approach. The second pshat in the word yafli is he says it means to separate from the pleasures of this world. The idea of so in other words, you've got distinguish as the first pshat. The second one is to separate, and therefore that's represented by wine because that symbolizes the pleasures of this world in the sense of drunkenness, etc., etc., etc. And that's what it means. And therefore that's the idea of separating from the pleasures of this world. The person might take a vow to be a nozer to achieve that. And the third one, he says, is that it is an idea of elevating oneself. That's what yafli means, to elevate oneself, but not in a positive way. The idea of separating from this entire from the world to sort of treat as forbidden something which everyone else treats as permitted. Okay, that's what it means, ki yafli. He wants to make himself separate, and the way he phrases it, based on the Gemara Nedarim, the Gemara Nedarim says, "Hanoda ki'ilu bona boma." Someone who makes a vow, it's as if he's built a private altar. Why? Because this person's gone out on a limb to make Torah says it's mutter, and you're saying it's also. This whole idea, there's this element of this in Nozeh, bring a korban chatos. Some say because, why did he bring a sin offering? Because he shouldn't have done it. Hashem wants us to go through and enjoy this well. So those are three different explanations of the kliyokar in the word yafli. Why is it that at the end, if you look in Pasuk Yud Gimel, he has to bring a korban. V'zos Toras Hanozer b'yom melos yimei nizro. Right? Why does he have to bring a whole series of korbanos? The Ramban says because he sinned. Right? He's actually doing something wrong by coming out of the Nazirus, according to Rabbi. It's the opposite, right? Why? Because he's been so holy, such a madrega, he's very kodesh, yeah. And all of a sudden he said, "No, I'm turning my back on this. I actually want the wine again." Yeah, so he's turning his back on it. So he's got to bring a korban because you should be able to maintain that level of Kedusha. That's what the Ramban says. But there's Rabbeinu Bachai, who has almost the not only the opposite, but he says the korbanos are there for the following reason. This person has been on a very high level, has existed on a very lofty plane. Okay, now he wants to depart. So it looks like he, as the Ramban says, right? It looks like he doesn't want anymore. I want an easy life now. Says Rabbeinu Bachai, korban b'yom melos, v'lo lekapara. It's not an atonement, because it doesn't say that here. These psukim, when he brings the korbanos to the end, it doesn't say kapara, atonement, doesn't say slicha, forgiveness. Hakavona v'korbono lekariv hakochos, or liyached, or lahamshich lahem shefa min hamakar, v'yistapka midus v'achaf yachzor lahanasa kavat chila. What he says is that he has to somehow find a way of, if you like, bringing together the maila he's achieved, the madrega he's achieved, the level he's achieved. He can't just move on. He's got to find a way of bringing together, because lekarev hakochos, to unify those what he's achieved during this time as a nozer, and to continue to benefit from them. And only then, after he completes that obligation and he's sort of fed his good midas in that way, then he can go back and drink wine and go back to how he enjoys, like everyone, and be the same as everyone else, right? What I think he's saying is that whenever a person achieves a certain level, we get a moment of inspiration. Yeah, you can go through some Yom Tovim, whatever, and you feel very, sort of spiritually charged. There's always a problem, and the problem is the next day is back to normal again, right? So how do you get? So the idea of the nozer bringing the korbanos is almost like, I think this is how we can understand. I think we can understand Rabbeinu Bachai this way, that the idea of a nozer is teaching us, and the process he goes through, how to depart properly from a spiritual high. That's as important as achieving that spiritual high. You can be there on Rosh Hashanah. You can be there at an inspirational moment, but unless you know, and unless you've thought carefully how to leave, how to exit it, then it just disappears. So the message of the korbanos that the nozer brings is, when departing a level of Kedusha, don't forget to reflect on what you've gained, bring it together, allow it to affect above all one's midas. Make sure that we if you like, use that to recharge our batteries, so that when we finally move on, it remains with us. The effect of it remains with us when we go back to the real world, which I think is a very beautiful idea. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much. Shkoyach.
Okay, take care. Have a good Shabbos.
Thank you. Shabbos.
Pleasure. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos.